Does Pat Gelsinger have the worst job in tech? The simple, easy part of his job is to restore Intel to leadership in x86 CPU design, where AMD currently outperforms Intel chips in pretty much every market segment in which they compete, and restore Intel to leadership in chip fabrication so that Intel can restore its previous strategy of making up for slips in competitiveness in one area with leadership in the other area, plus modernizing that strategy for a world that is now mostly full of specialists in chip design or chip fabrication. It's a plausible strategy, but an insanely difficult strategy to implement. That word modernizing is doing a lot of work right here, but a full explanation is not for this video. That, I will remind you, is the simple and easy part of his job. On top of all that, it turns out that the 13th and 14th generation Intel desktop, but not laptop CPU chips were failing in the field after being deployed in supposedly high-quality systems from reputable makers. After years of reliable use, sometimes these CPUs are simply failing, permanently, with irreparable internal damage. As it turns out, the word simply is both accurate and grossly inadequate to describe the cluster of circumstances that led to these failures. Keep in mind that the use of the word cluster here is only half a word. In the x86 personal computer world, parts of it are fairly simple. Brands like HP and Dell and Lenovo would sell you a whole personal computer, and it's up to that brand to back their products and make sure they are reliable. But under that facade, they need to bring together, most obviously, the CPU chip, a motherboard, and a BIOS that enables that chip to perform certain functions. BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System. It was a component of the original IBM PC that has evolved and become vastly more complex as personal computers have themselves evolved. It gets worse. Of course it does. There are a lot of people who put together their own desktop systems, especially gamers. You can go down to Micro Center and buy a CPU, a motherboard, and a case, plus probably a high-end GPU that throws off plenty of heat, and all the thermal engineering and quality of putting this together is up to the customer. That makes diagnosing instability devilishly hard. The CPU and the microcode in the CPU, the BIOS, and the motherboard are the components of the cluster of this cluster. Intel created CPUs that, if you adhere to the specification, would perform reliably pretty much indefinitely. But they also enabled BIOS makers to tweak performance. In part, this is accomplished by raising the voltages inside the chip as it performs certain operations at certain clock frequencies. Being aggressive about this to extract maximum performance from a CPU isn't underhanded or malicious. It's part of being competitive in the BIOS business. And part of the problem is in the microcode inside the CPU that interprets what the BIOS is telling it to do. Likewise, motherboard makers have chosen their BIOS by its ability to extract maximum performance from the CPU. High-quality motherboards are carefully tested. They all seemed okay, which is why this fault emerges years into the life of a computer. If the PC business were more like cars, where, for example, Honda is being held responsible for bad connecting rod bearings in their engines, the brands like Dell and HP would be on the hook for this problem. But everybody knows they're buying a CPU, or at least most people know they're buying a CPU with an Intel or AMD CPU, and on the other hand, they've got no idea who makes the BIOS or motherboard. So it's Intel's turn in the barrel. It's a problem that can be overcome by updating the BIOS, the microcode, or both. But if damage to the CPU has already occurred, it's possible there's a set of systems on the brink of failure that will be unreliable in unpredictable ways. An objective assessment would conclude there's shared responsibility for this failure, and the shared responsibility is an inevitable result of the way PC-compatible computers are made. PCs evolved from cost-optimized, simple systems aimed at putting a smidgen of computing on users' desktops to high-performance systems that are pushing the limits of technology and manufacturing in all the major components. But the players in the ecosystem fill their same roles and have the same relationships. It's a wonder it still works. But it's Intel chips that are failing, and that is a big part of what makes Pat Gelsinger's job the worst job in the tech industry right now.